Hello everybody, I'm Gwen Campbell-Mindes. Welcome to Gwen's Bookish Ramblings, and this is the second book of the Didius Falco series, in which our gumshoe PI in ancient Rome winds up. This is a continuation of the first book of the Silver Pigs. In this one, we pick up right after with Falco still employed, sort of, by the emperor. See, the interesting thing about this is that while Falco is a staunch Republican, that is, not Republican in the American sense, but in the sense of believing in a government of the people as opposed to a government run by, an emperor or a king or some such, he nonetheless winds up being hired by the palace, one suspects in no small part because he is smart, and he gets results, and perhaps most importantly, because the Emperor Vespasian is known for being a cheapskate, his rates are cheap, because he is he is from the lower classes, he's a plebeian, but more than being a plebeian, he also does not make a lot of money because, well, we all know that PIs don't, as a general rule, make money. That's why they're in their scummy offices with, only one functioning light bulb and living off of cheap coffee, and it's because they don't make a lot of money. Well, Falco doesn't make a lot of money. And so this is doubly a problem because, well, the mysteries, and in this case, he's attempting to solve a mystery of conspiracy against the new emperor because, in a way he works for the emperor in some ways because a gig is a gig. But also because one does not turn down an emperor when he says, you should work for me. But in the meantime, there continues the romance that started in the first book, because in the first book in this series, Marcus falls in love with Helena, who is a lovely young woman of the patrician class. That is, she is of the nobility, and he is of the poor serfdom, to put it in a slightly more recent idiom that might be more understandable if you don't know anything about classes in Rome, which, by the way, I know nothing about classes in Rome. Everything I know I learned from reading these books. The point is that Rome is caste-based, caste with an E at the end, and what that means is that you are sort of locked into your position in life. Now, you can, and this is discussed in the first book, buy your way up to the next sort of level, but it takes an absolutely forbidding amount of money, which means only really, really well-off, rich people can raise the money to move up to the next caste level. And so, while Falco would like to be able to move into a slightly better caste level, because if he can move at all upwards, then he will be slightly more, worthy of Helena, which, right now, he's basically a poor man who is having a sort of an affair with a rich man's daughter. A divorcee, of course, because she was married and got divorced, and this was a thing in the first book, but this comes back in this book, because this book there's a very complicated plot going on in which it turns out that her ex-husband, who they thought had been killed in the last book, it turns out he's not actually dead. It was his sort of sidekicky friend Barnabas, except he pretends to be Barnabas, and so everybody thinks he's Barnabas, but he's not. And it's a whole thing. Anyway, so he goes through all of this, and the romance with Helena sort of is this ongoing thread. And it was a thread in the first book that they met, and it was the not precisely enemies to lovers trope, but it was the mistrustful young woman who thinks he's taking advantage of her younger cousin, and grouchy, slightly older PI who doesn't trust anybody, gradually finding their way to each other, but it's a wild affair, not anything that one would expect to go places. But the thing is that this book makes it very clear that they are, in this series, in for the long haul, because, among other things, she turns out to A, be pregnant, and B, she miscarries. It is implied, by the way, that her miscarriage is due to somebody assaulting her, but the point is that, there's this whole scene where he says, why didn't you tell me? And she says, I thought I'd have more time to. It makes it very, very clear that they both want to be in a permanent relationship, and that most of what's holding them back are things like a sense of social correctness, and in no small part because Falco really, really wants to treat her in the way that he feels she deserves. And that's the thing, is she is a patrician. She's from a rich family. She is used to the finer things in life, and what he can offer her is a third-rate, 10th-rate apartment with, in the bad part of town, with highly noisy and invasive neighbors and his incredibly noisy and invasive family. And he wants to do better. He wants her to have better. Anyway, so we go through this book with him digging through all of these various events, and honestly, it's fascinating because we managed to bring the cast of characters with us. That he has a friend, Petronius Longus, who is a member of, I believe, the Vigiles, but basically he's a cop, and his cop friend is going on vacation, and Falco manages to worm his way into their vacation to use it as a cover to get where he's going to do his investigation. So we've brought his cop friend along for the ride just so we can still have him there. It's just, this is a really, really twisty book. The first book gets dark in places, and it has a long road to the solution of what's going on. These books are not often straightforward murder mysteries. It's very, very not a thing in these books for someone to find a dead body and then he looks into it until he finds the murderer. Usually there's a lot of conspiracy, a lot of half a dozen people are involved in a complex series of triple dealings with each other because double dealing isn't enough. We need extra complicated dealings. So it's one of the things that makes these stand apart, not merely that these are set in an unusual setting for that 1930s hard-boiled gumshoe PI thing, not just that this is an unusual setting, but that there's a lot in these books, a lot that's interwoven, and, you know, his Imperial Majesty is constantly interwoven into this as well, because Falco keeps on getting himself hired to the palace, but also he keeps on stomping into the palace to confront people about money that he's owed, about the fact that, you know, he's being chased for fraud, but that's in the next book, and we'll talk about that next week. There's all kinds of things, and they sort of spiral outward in this, and so the investigations in these sort of jump all over the place and leap from thing to thing to thing, but these first two books, the Imperial presence is a very, very heavy one. It's a particularly weighty thing that's sort of just sitting there and being insistent on Falco doing this work for the government, in effect. And so, while you can see the traces of that whole concept of, I was in my office having a drink and the dame sauntered in her red dress. It's there, but there's so much more there, and it makes these books really, really delightful. And you'll see Love, Death, and Politics Under Vesuvius. That's because they do, in fact, go through Pompeii in this. Pompeii, obviously, before Vesuvius erupted, and it's actually one of the interesting things in this book because the time that this is set, and he says this as our narrator, discussing what Pompeii was like before Vesuvius erupted, what kind of a place it was, and talks about, among other things, briefly just, the aftermath of Pompeii, because it's something to keep in mind when you talk about the ancient world, that these things like Pompeii, which to us are just artifacts with these occasionally horrifying and grisly memories of captured moments in time, but that these were, concurrent events for people. And so, when he talks about it and he says that 8 years later and the eruption happened, it adds this sense of connection to the real world in these, to sort of wander entirely off track, because that's what I do in these. I ramble, and I have genuinely rambled in this one. But him talking about Pompeii sets these sort of in the world in a way that almost all of the references to recognizable historical figures don't, because when you talk about something like Pompeii, it's not like a history where a history book in its way can be just as fictional as any work of fiction, but Pompeii is a real place. And it's a real place that you can visit, and a real place where you can walk through this unexpected mass grave and see everything just frozen in that moment in time. And it's something that sort of, I think, adds a gravitas to the background of this book, a weight of reality. And in a way, I think Shadows in Bronze does that more than the first book, because, like, the first book, there's this period of enslavement where he talks about a mentality of just existing day to day and living in the moment and understanding exactly how to get through the day and existing in a constant state of despair and a whole bunch of other things. But it nonetheless doesn't have that same weight that referencing a place that is real and still exists today in a massively transformed fashion. It's something that's very, very different, and I don't know, I mean, maybe that's just a me thing, but I feel like it lends a sort of a heaviness to this book, a reality to it. But anyways, I'm basically at my 15 minutes, and so I will wrap this up, and you should know I will be recording the next one in just a few minutes, even though it'll be a week later for all, like, 3 of you who actually watch my videos. So, I think that's everything that I'm going to incoherently say, and I will see you all next week.